I'm honored today to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Valerie Hudson from the University of Texas A&M. She's the university's distinguished professor and George Bush Chair, Professor of International Affairs, a former Vice President of ISA. I have to take a breath because there are so many things listed. And she has been the founding and named the inaugural Vice Chancellor of Australia and the World Visiting Fellow at NU. And she was also a distinguished scholar of foreign policy analysis section at ISA. And she was a founding member of the founding editorial board member of Foreign Policy Analysis Journal. And in 2009, Foreign Policy named her one of the top 100 most influential global thinkers. And her works has appeared in International Security, American Political Science Review, Journal of Peace Research, Political Psychology, and Politics and Gender. She's now directing the Bush School's program on women, peace, and security, the Women's Stats Project, which is really, really fascinating. I encourage all of you to take a look at the rich data set from the project. She has been a great mentor and model for many young scholars in the field of international security, foreign policy analysis, and gender studies. I met Valerie. I was lucky to have met her here in Australia 3 times. Every time she was working on a new project and with a book publication. And today she's presenting on her latest book, the newest co-authored book, The First Political Order, How Sex Shaped Governance and National Security Worldwide. One distinguished scholar of the field of foreign policy analysis. She's well respected, and this book, in one reviewer said, this is Professor Rose MacDonald. The First Political Order is a magisterial tour de force that transforms our understanding of international relations. And I'm sure that we'll all look forward to your talk. And the floor is yours, Valerie.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to have been invited to address the class. And I can only imagine that you've been having a wonderful time with Professor Fung. He's really delightful. I think actually we first met when you were at Utah State University many years ago, actually. So I am so glad that we've kept in touch. I'm here to talk with you about the new book, and let's see, is it for Fernando who's going to do the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I will just say, you know, next slide or something like that. So let's stay on the slide. On the left, you see the cover of the book, and so my remarks today will be a drastic abridgment. The book clocks in at 612 pages and is kind of the culmination of all the work that I've done over the last 25 years in the field of women, peace, and security. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, great. I see it now. Maybe there's a lag between what you're doing in Australia and what I see on the screen. Okay, so what is this first political order? Sounds a lot like Star Wars First Order, but what we're trying to get at here is an idea that is not new with us, but has been around for a very long time, which is that the first political order in any society is the sexual political order established between men and women. Philosophers have called sexual difference. No, please go back. Can you go back, please? Would you go to the next slide that I was talking about?
You mean this one or the previous one?
Yes, stay on this one.
All right.
No, the previous one, I'm sorry.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, wonderful. If you had no religious differences, no ethnic differences, no racial differences within a society, if the society was completely homogeneous, you would still have sexual difference. And that is why philosophers call it the first difference in capital letters. Interestingly, sometimes when my class and I talk about this concept, I say, let's pretend that we're actually in a video design class. And I'm just going to give you a few parameters and you make a game for me. Make me a video game. And I say, just 2 parameters. In your game, there are 2 groups that are of roughly equal size. And if they do not cooperate, there is no second round. At that point, they usually say, well, Professor Hudson, you need to tell us more, right? So how do these 2 groups stand before each other? Are they equals? Is one group superior and one group inferior? Are decisions for the group going to be made by one of these 2 groups or by both? Will conflicts that arise between the interests of these 2 groups be resolved peacefully or by force and domination? Will resources be distributed equally between the 2 groups? Or can one group extort resources from the other? Notice that all the questions that my students are asking are deeply political questions. These are questions about power, conflict, and resource distribution. So again, this is not a new idea, but the idea is politics is first formed by the character of the male-female relationship within a society. And the character of that first political order, that is the sexual political order, will mold the society, its governance, and its behavior. And that's what we're going to delve into today. Okay, next slide. Great. So for the first 15, 20 years that I was doing this kind of research, I thought for sure that where I needed to go to look for indicators of the relative status of men and women in society, to see what that first political order is, that I should be looking at things like female literacy, female labor force participation, and female parliamentary representation. And yet about a dozen years ago, I had a very crucial conversation. At least it was crucial for my own research. My university at the time was hosting a group of Afghan female members of parliament, members of the Loya Jirga. And I was in charge of sitting by one particular MP at lunchtime. And it was a beautiful sunny day. And, you know, sometimes when you're an academic and you're a little introverted, you know, you're struggling for things to say. And so I said, you know, isn't it just wonderful? You know, here you are, you're university educated, you know, you worked as a doctor and now you're a member of the Loya Jirga. You know, this is the future for Afghan women. This is empowerment. And, you know, she stopped me right there and she said, Valerie, you don't understand. She said, I could go home and my husband could divorce me by simply saying, I divorce you 3 times. And if he did, I would not have custody of my children. Furthermore, my family would not take me back and I would have nowhere to live. And she said, even if my husband does not divorce me, I may have virtually no say in who my children marry or when they married. So how empowered am I really? And that really set me back on my heels. And I began to understand that here I was looking at things like female literacy, but we have countries that have extremely high female literacy and women are not empowered. We have countries with extremely high female labor force participation, but women are not empowered. We have countries with extremely high female parliamentary representation, over half, and women are not empowered in those societies. So while those are interesting and important to look at, what I'm more interested now after that conversation is the first political order. And I want to look for that order at the level of the household. I want to ask, how disempowered are women at the household level? So I want to be asking questions like, how much say does a woman have about getting married? And how old is she when she is married? How much say does a woman have when she is married? What types of property and inheritance rights do women have? Are there inequities in family law, such as this female MP who would lose custody of her children if her husband divorced her? Is marriage patrilocal? Does the bride go and live with the groom and his family? Are bride price or dowry paid? Bride price is where the groom's family pays the bride's family on marriage, and dowry is the reverse, where the bride's family pays the groom's family upon marriage. Do we have prevalent polygyny or cousin marriage? Does the society view domestic violence and femicide as normal, even expected in certain circumstances? Is rape treated as a property crime against the father of the girl or against the husband of the girl? These are the kinds of questions where you will see what the first political order really is. Okay, next slide. Great. So the theoretical framework that my co-authors and I have put together is that we see that there's kind of a syndrome of practices that hang together and create kind of a straitjacket for women. And the greater the instantiation of these components of the straitjacket, the more subordinated women are within a society. So if you look at the top left there, we might start out with the willingness of males to coerce females, right? To use physical force against females within the household. And that this is in turn linked to primary male control over resource access. And oftentimes we see that women lack property and inheritance rights that would give them access to such resources. We would look at patrilineality and patrilocal marriage, which often go together with cousin marriage. We would then see that this disempowered state of women often leads to son preference and the devaluation of the lives of daughters and wives. As girls are seen as a burden and not as a blessing, you often see a low age of marriage for girls. And all of this begins to culminate in deep inequity in family law and customs regarding rights in marriage and personal status. We then see coming up the left-hand side that we see two patterns of subordination for women. In one pattern, where women's labor is valuable, you'll see the development of what we call bride price polygyny societies, where since women's labor is valuable, such as we see in sub-Saharan Africa for agricultural purposes, the groom's family pays the bride's family for the loss of the girl's labor. And oftentimes rich men then buy many wives in a polygynous situation so that they can have larger agricultural holdings or enrich their own resource base. Alternatively, where women's labor is not valued, we often see the rise of a society characterized by dowry and by sex ratio alteration. In this type of society, the bride's family is paying the groom's family to take the unproductive girl off their hands. And oftentimes this leads to a calculation by families that they would rather not keep daughters, that either through sex-selective abortion or female infanticide, we can see an alteration in the sex ratios. So it's very interesting to see how many of these practices cross space and time, right? That is to say that you can find them in China, you can find them in sub-Saharan Africa, you can find them in Indian communities in the north of Canada. You can find many of these components. They seem to be almost universal. And they do create this kind of straitjacket. But so what we would like to assert, go ahead and give us the next slide, please, is that this syndrome is actually a monster of frightful mien, as the poet has said. And that in fact, this syndrome is not just going to trap women, but it is also going to trap whole societies. And it's going to trap them into a poorer outcome, more conflictual outcomes, less healthy outcomes, less stable outcomes, less democratic outcomes. Because remember, what we're talking about with the relations between men and women are the first political order, the template for all other phenomena in the society. And so if this template is one of violence, subordination, and exploitation, right, of women, then this is also what you will see in the larger society. Go ahead and turn to the next page or next slide. So we see the syndrome as really a trap. While it ensures male privilege and male entitlement and male access to resources, we also assert that what it leads to is governance by extended male kin networks. And that the result of this type of governance is instability, violence, terror, corruption, and autocracy, because it's built on the same characteristics that you find at the level of male-female relations. Furthermore, we think that such a society will also experience sequelae of those characteristics: poor health, food insecurity, low economic performance, rentierism, demographic woes, and lack of attention to environmental security. In other words, if you take nothing else from this presentation, please take the following: what you do to your women, you do to your nation state. Okay, next slide. My screen is still loading. I sort of see two slides superimposed upon one each. There we go. Okay. What you see here is a map in which we took that 11 component syndrome, operationalized it, and then using our research funding, it was actually the US Department of Defense that funded the data collection and analysis for this research project. I think you can see there the range of countries and to what degree you can find those 11 subordinative practices within the society, right? And I think you can see for yourself that the countries which have the greatest number of these practices are countries that are less secure. But we're going to go into that in a more rigorous sense in a moment. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, let me give you a couple of examples so that you can see the linkages that we see. Sometimes the links between what's going on with women and national security and stability are pretty immediate and proximate. And one good example that we discuss in our book is surging bride prices. We've talked about how bride price is money or other valuables that are given to the bride's family in recompense for giving up the valuable labor and reproductive capacities of the girl, the bride. And usually within bride price societies, except at the very top end and the very, very bottom end, bride price is a regressive and universal flat tax on the subpopulation of young men. There's usually a quote-unquote going rate for a bride price within bride price societies. What happens is that, though sometimes forced by governments that try to put ceilings or caps on bride price is very much like, say, the Sydney real estate market, which is to say that it tends to rise inexorably over time. And it can rise very swiftly and rather dramatically as well. And that surging bride prices are also linked to increased prevalence of polygyny, because as bride prices rise, the rich can still afford to buy brides, but the poor or lower middle class are unable to come up with bride price. And this begins to obstruct the marriage market for disadvantaged young men, where no matter how hard they work, they're never going to be able to come up with the amount of money that is necessary for a bride price. And what we see then is a deep sense of grievance begins to arise among young men, because within these highly patrilineal societies, a young man is not fully an adult until he marries and begins to have children, especially a son. And so, not surprisingly, you find terror groups and rebel groups notice that there is this growing sense of grievance and the inability to get married. And they offer to solve this problem by offering either bride price or brides, and therefore find recruiting much easier in circumstances where bride prices are surging. Next slide, please. Great. A wonderful example, of course, is Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. There was a huge and dramatic jump in bride price in northern Nigeria in the early 2000s, a 500% increase in a very short period of time. And Boko Haram openly used this as a recruiting strategy. The Western press focused on the abduction of schoolgirls. And that's absolutely right to do so, but it's also true that Boko Haram would always leave a token bride price on the ground in order to legitimate the marriage. All right, so that the bride price could be said to have been paid. And so one young lady who unfortunately had this happen to her said, "In this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge. Usually it is very expensive to take a wife, very hard to get married, but not now." And then in our research, we found the same dynamic linking surging bride prices to the rise of terror and rebel groups in as diverse a set of nations as South Sudan, Pakistan, and Timor-Leste. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, that's an example of a proximate and pretty immediate link. But it's also true that a very subordinative first political order can also create longer-term structural problems for the security of the nation. So an example of this would be increasing masculinization of the world's population. The male-female overall sex ratio should be about 98 men per 100 women, because women tend to live longer than men. But that ratio is now over 101.8 men per 100 women. And this is highly abnormal and was not caused by any natural disaster or plague or anything of the sort. This is man-made. In 1990, when I first started studying sex ratios, we had 5 countries that had abnormal birth sex ratios, and 2 of them were Hong Kong and Macau, which since that time, are no longer nations. But now we have 19 nations, including nations as diverse as Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, China, Egypt, Fiji, Georgia, India, Kosovo, Kuwait, Lebanon, Montenegro, the Philippines, South Sudan, Sudan, Taiwan, Macedonia, Vanuatu, and Vietnam. And then there are others. We're starting to get the census results in for 2020. Pakistan and other nations should be on this list as well. It's also true that migrant flows can also cause sex ratio abnormalities in countries that have no native sex ratio alteration. So for example, in 2015, when the first wave of migrants came into Europe, Sweden, to their credit, opened their doors and welcomed people in. And they also asserted that if you were under 18, you would not be deported for any reason. So the first wave of migrants in any great migration tends to be young men who are better able to handle the rigors and the safety concerns of migration. That's exactly what we saw. So 85% of the migrants that went to Sweden in 2015 were men. And they came in such numbers, with all of them attempting to declare that they were under 18, that in 2016, Sweden reported a sex ratio among its 16 and 17-year-olds of 123 men per 100 women, which is far worse than China's ratio for that same age group, which was only 117 men per 100 women. Next slide, please. Now, there's a number of important ramifications here. Research has shown that a highly masculinized sex ratio increases crime rates and political protest rates. There's also marriage market obstruction, with men greatly and significantly outnumbering women. If there is bride price in a society, you get a surging bride price. So for example, China, the going rate for a bride price now is 250,000 renminbi, which is absolutely astounding compared to what it was just 10 years ago. And then of course, leading to issues like rebel recruitment that we've seen before. There's usually a significant rise in crimes against women, trafficking, kidnapping, forced prostitution. And as a result, there's mobility restriction for women. And even Sweden has seen some mobility restriction for women as a result of their sex ratio alteration. The spread of HIV and STD is increased, and there may even be ramifications for deterrence. With a masculinized sex ratio, you may look at wars of attrition much differently than a country that has a normal or fairly equal sex ratio. Next slide, please. Okay, so all of the case studies are wonderful. I love qualitative case studies. They're one of my favorite things to do. But it's also true that in academic research, mixed method designs are far stronger than only qualitative or only quantitative research. So using the money that we were given by the US Department of Defense, we spent 4 years operationalizing the syndrome and then looking at a variety of outcome measures related to national stability, security, resilience, and so forth, using 7 control variables and using multiple operationalizations of the outcome variables so that no one could accuse us of cherry picking our results. We also use an incredibly stringent bar for significance. In social science research, one usually sees a level of significance of, say, less than 0.05. More rarely, you see less than 0.01. but we decided that we would not consider a result to be significant unless the significance measure came out as less than 0.001. So we looked at clusters of outcome variables: political stability and governance, security and conflict, economic performance, economic rentierism, health and well-being, demographic security, education, social progress, and environmental protection. My co-authors had to convince me to put environmental protection in there. I said, tell me the linkage here. What's the linkage here? And they convinced me by saying, look, what you do to women, you're going to do to Mother Earth, right? Because the Earth is going to be feminized or viewed in female, in a female manner, and will be treated in the manner that females are treated within the society. Okay, next slide. Okay, so you're not supposed to read this slide, but for my own purposes, I decided to list all of the 122 outcome variables that we examined. And so we went to great lengths to ensure that no one could accuse us of cherry picking our results. If you look at this list here, you'll see all sorts of variables and different operationalizations of the same variable and so forth. All right, go ahead. Next slide. Okay, so what were our findings? Well, if we break it down by cluster, what we found in our multivariate regression was that the most determinant, and what I mean by that is the variable with the largest effect size in multiple multivariate regression modeling, and significant. And again, what I mean by significant is significant at the 0.001 level. Across those 22 measures we examined, the most determinant and significant predictor was the measure of women's household disempowerment, that syndrome measure. Next slide, or next click, and click again. Go back. Across 35 measures of conflict and insecurity, the most determinant and significant predictor of all the 7 was the syndrome, 75% of model runs. Next, click twice. So once you'll get blank, and then the next you'll get a new cluster. 10 measures of political terror, 80% of model runs. The best predictor, the most valuable predictor, was women's disempowerment. Okay, next set. 22 measures of economic performance. This was really interesting to me, was how important the subordination of women was in predicting bad economic outcomes. Next set of next cluster. 31 measures of public health and well-being. Over 70% of model runs. Your best predictor was women's household disempowerment. And that makes perfect sense, because caring for others' bodies, their health, their welfare is often a very highly gendered task within the household. Okay, next cluster. 11 measures of environmental preservation. So I'm glad my co-authors talked me into it. Is 85.7% of model runs, found that when you subordinate women, you can also predict that the nation will not care about environmental preservation. Okay, next set of findings. 7 measures of demographic security, pretty straightforward. The character of male-female relations is absolutely going to affect key demographic security indicators. And that's what we found in our testing as well. And next set of findings. Okay, education, again, 60% of model runs. All right, go ahead, next one. Social progress, 75% of model runs. So next slide. So across all of those 122 outcome variables, looking at all sorts of dimensions of national security and stability and resilience, in 71.3% of the cases, the variable that would be most valuable to you in predicting that outcome would be the subordination of women at the household. Okay, next slide. Okay, folks are multiple results. And actually, I optimize the outcome variable so that I calculate odds. So how these ideas work is you're saying for every that works in within this environment, how the chances of getting a real contract, you have 2.13 times the chance of being a fragile state, 3.53 times the chance of having a government that is more autocratic, less effective, and more corrupt. 1.5 times the chance of being unstable and violent. 1.28 times the chance of experiencing terrorism. 1.4 times the chance of having your country be poor and in economic decline. 1.5 times the chance of having a low GDP per capita. 1.55 times the chance of having low environmental quality. 1.92 times the chance of having a high fertility rate. 1.83 times the chance, a higher incidence of preventable deaths, and 1.8 times the chance of scoring worse on the global hunger index. So this kind of is the statistical underpinning for when we say, you know, what you do to your women is what you do to your nation state. And so if you choose to you know, subordinate your women, you're not going to be helping your nation state outcomes at all. Okay, next slide. So Rose McDermott, in talking about one part of our research design, said something that I think was really noteworthy. She said, the findings are clear, consistent, and statistically robust across the board. In fact, the results are the kind of thing most social scientists strive for, but almost never find in the course of their careers. If these findings were about something not related to women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary in international relations theory. Indeed, the effects are much stronger than those supporting the notion of the democratic peace that has spawned an entire cottage industry of inquiry. I leave it to the reader to ponder why powerful effects regarding the treatment of women on the health and security of states do not receive such extensive attention. Well, that's a really good question. Okay, next slide, please. So again, why are we seeing these results? And so we put forward in our theory section that there's at least 3 causal mechanisms at work. The first we call the boot camp mechanism. That is, there's no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration, lived domestic corruption and exploitation, lived domestic autocracy. Growing up in that kind of household is going to train you in how functional it is to be autocratic, corrupt, exploitative, and violent. In fact, Eric Melander and Aaron Bjarnegard have found that one of the most significant predictors of a person engaging in political violence is how misogynist their attitudes are toward women. And we absolutely can see why that link would hold. The second mechanism is, as we've already discussed with relation to bride price and sex ratio alteration is that the syndrome begins to build in structural instability, or what we call chronic structural goads to engaging in political violence. So the minute you adopt bride price, you're gonna destabilize your society. The minute you begin to cull girls from the birth population, you have destabilized your society, right? So a first political order that subordinates women is going to be almost by definition unstable. And then lastly, another mechanism is that you are disempowering specifically women. That is, the very individuals whose influence could profoundly challenge the calculus of political violence. So boot camp, chronic structural goads, and disempowerment of women's voices, I think, are all very important mechanisms in understanding why we got the statistical results that we did. Okay, next slide. So when I give this talk in DC, I usually at this point say, do you consider yourself a national security realist? And I can assure you that everybody in Washington, DC considers themselves a national security realist. And so I say, okay, well, in light of the findings we've just presented, right? Qualitative findings, quantitative findings, immense data collection, backed by the DoD. So are you a realist if you believe that the treatment of women affects nation-state outcomes? Are you a realist if you believe the women, peace, and security agenda is in the national interest? And most importantly, can you really call yourself a realist if you don't believe these things? That's a very interesting conversation to have when you're in Washington, DC. Okay, next slide. So what does change when we become realists? Usually at this point, all right, there'll be a number of people who say, okay, I get it, but like, so what would change, right? What would we do differently? So let me suggest a few things that we might do differently. And this is all US centered. I apologize, but I can imagine that you could consider this with relation to Australia as well. If the US is not tracking the situation of women, especially at the household level, as we've discussed, how can it expect to have an effective foreign policy? For example, how will it accurately anticipate instability in other countries if it is unaware of linkages related to syndrome components, such as bride price and polygyny? Okay. If the US, I'm sorry, go ahead. And one more, click one more time. How will the US decide which subnational actors in another country, right? Oftentimes we're dealing with countries that have various subnational actors that are vying for political control, and the US is often asked to support one or more of them. So how would the US decide which subnational actors are most likely to bring stability in the long term if it does not first examine how each group treats women before making that commitment? And if there's time later on, remind me to tell you just a brilliant story that Gloria Steinem tells about this particular point. Okay, 2 clicks. How will the US avoid the trap of peace negotiations where the rights of women are bargained away to make peace between warlords if it does not understand the linkage between sustainable peace and the empowerment of women? And I think we're seeing a tragedy unfold in Afghanistan as we speak, as women have been sidelined from the peace negotiations there. I don't think that sidelining is going to bode well for the outcomes in that case. All right, 2 more clicks. How will the US track which of its own citizens are the greatest internal threat to security if domestic violence is not taken as a serious threat? I'm sure you've seen maybe you haven't seen the articles in the US press that suggest that one of the things that 96% of all mass shooters in the United States have had in common is that they have been accused of, arrested for, or convicted of domestic abuse against their mother or their sister or their girlfriend or their wife. Okay, that's pretty stunning, and I think coincides with Melander and Bjarnegard's findings that misogynistic attitudes are a very telling predictor of willingness to engage in violence. Okay, 2 more clicks. How will the US rationally approach immigration policy if it does not comprehend that the true clash of civilizations is not about religion or ethnicity, but about the subordination of women? How will it understand that tolerating enclaves of family or personal status law that subordinate women will destabilize its society? And I must admit that at this point, I usually hold your own country, Australia, up as an example. You know, the new citizenship test for becoming an Australian has questions like, is female genital cutting legal in Australia? Is arranged marriage legal? Is beating your wife legal in Australia? And a lot of people, when those questions were put on the test, poo-pooed and said, well, you know, they'll just answer, you know, the way they think you want them to answer. These questions do nothing. Well, I say that's not right. I say that these questions are highly important because it puts all who want to come to Australia and become citizens, whether male or female, it puts them on notice that the subordination of women is not tolerated in your society. And so I think that is a very important part of immigration reform that I'd like to see in our own country. All right, next one. How would the US know that ending something like child marriage worldwide would probably do more for world peace than almost any other investment, including the export of democracy? Once you understand that issues that are considered quote unquote women's issues like child marriage actually completely destroy a country's ability to progress and to become healthier and wealthier and more secure, then your foreign policy priorities and where you invest your aid and foreign assistance funds, I think, would change. All right, next one. So how will the US know when exporting democracy makes sense and when it doesn't? Let me tell you that if your society is instantiating, say, you know, 10 of the 11 variables that we examine, your society is not ready for democracy. Okay, it can't even conceive of democracy because there's been no experience of democracy in the home. You'd be much better off trying to export democracy to countries that were kind of in that middle range, or what we call transition countries, where they've begun to dismantle many of the components of female household disempowerment. That's your best bet for where to export democracy. And you won't understand that unless you're looking with gender lenses. All right, go ahead. I believe, and I sincerely believe this, that one day the idea that foreign policy or national security policy could ignore the situation of women will be seen as laughably naive. And yet I want to tell you that in the halls of power in my country, that idea is still considered sketchy. And that especially this particular administration does not see very much value in that understanding at all. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I think that given what we've been through, what we've discussed here today, it's fair to say that women's insecurity profoundly and significantly undermines state security. My favorite quote on this is by Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. In 2012, she said, "The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and the national security of our country." And I think she's absolutely right. And I think that disrupting the weak points of women's household disempowerment may be foundational to undercutting the roots of instability, conflict, and ineffective governance. I think only by adopting these gender lenses can we see these linkages and make our policies more effective. And then I think there's a last slide. Yep, and if you want to know more, we can, I would be delighted to engage your questions during Q&A, but also you can see all of our data in a wonderful interactive database where you can even create the kinds of maps that you saw in this presentation at our website, womanstats.org. Thank you very much.